arguments, throughout history, we have seen that Western democracies like to think that whatever values they're advocating for are the right ones. Western liberal democracies like to think that the issues that they take up and the influence that they have in different regions is always positive. And in some situations, of course this is true, and perhaps when the US and Canada and so on and so forth first entered Afghanistan, perhaps that was true. But we see that that's not the case any longer. And we see that currently, the fact that these Western governments are intervening in Afghanistan is an extremely negative thing. What we on Side Proposition would like to see today is change. And we want to see the change that would help Afghanistan to set up a sustainable future and a positive, thriving nation. Now, what I'd like to do in the second speech on Side Prop today is first start off with some refutation of the speech you just saw by the first op and rebuild my partner's case. And then I'll move into my constructive arguments, which are really going to focus on the fact that in order to create peace in Afghanistan, the West needs to lead. So let's take a look at that first idea, refutation. Now, the first point that he brought up was that we haven't yet really started the second stage of the mission in Afghanistan. But what we see is that we need to change the idea behind this mission. When a country invades another, or when a country tries to create change in another, they don't necessarily know what's going to happen. And they need to adapt their mission and adapt their plan in order to create the most positive change possible. Now, what they seem to be advocating for is short-term sustainability. They say that the West needs to set up a government so it's sustainable when we leave. But what we would see is that if the West sets up a government, that's not a long-term sustainable option, not at this time. We see that if the West were to set up a government, they do have to leave at some time or another. It's not possible, not feasible, and not sustainable for the West to stay there forever. So what we see is that then, when these countries that set up this democracy or government of sorts do end up leaving, Afghanistan won't have the skills necessary to keep it running, and it in fact will not be sustainable in the long term, and that's what we'd like to see ultimately, not at this time. Now, he said that currently Afghanistan doesn't have a great democracy in place, and that that's not something we want to leave them with. But as my partner explained, we need to allow Afghanistan to grow on their own independently as a nation. And if they do this, then they'll be able to create that positive change for themselves that hopefully will be sustainable in the long-term future. Now, the second point he brought forth was that we can't really run the government in war, or Afghanistan can't really run a government in wartime. But what we would argue on Side Prop today is that Western intervention is a major contributor to that wartime. We see that after the Taliban have largely been thrown from power, the fact that the West and these developed nations are still intervening in Afghanistan is creating peace and unrest in the nation, because they don't necessarily want their presence there. And we would say that this really is creating violence in the nation and is what's creating this type of wartime. We see that we don't necessarily, I'll take you in a second, know what's going to happen in Afghanistan after we leave, but we need to ensure that they can set up their own government system in order for it to be sustainable for them. Yeah.
So you would advocate leading before we have a chance to rebuild our relations with the peoples?
What we would say is that the people need to first build a stable relationship among themselves and build a stable government for themselves before they can focus on rebuilding the relationship with the West. We would say that we need to give them the opportunity to build their nation, and that is what is going to create positive relations. Knowing that the West and these countries that had first intervened gave them the chance to create their own government and own democracy in the future, or whatever style of government they choose, that is what we hope is going to create positive relations among this country and other neighboring countries in the future. Now, to do some rebuilding of my partner's point, now he essentially said the same thing as was in his own constructive argument, that we can't leave because they don't have that sustainable government currently. But again, we'd advocate that we cannot stay there forever, and we need to ensure that they are able to build on themselves as a nation. If you look, for example, when the Nazis were overthrown in Germany, other countries like England and the States did not stay there forever, even though there were Nazis there, just in case they took over again. They allowed Germany to rebuild their own sustainable democracy, and as we see now, they're a very thriving nation. We need to give Afghanistan the chance to show that they can, in fact, survive without the Taliban. Now, we know that they hopefully will be able to build a sustainable government for themselves in the future, and that will be positive. Now, to get into some constructive argumentation. Now, what I'd like to talk to you about today is how the fact that the West is still present in Afghanistan is actually creating a lot of hostilities within the nation. And then I'll also talk to you about how, if we leave, it will help Afghanistan positively increase their relations with other neighboring countries. So we see that really, when these different countries went in, as was stated actually by Side Opposition and my partner, we saw that one of their main goals was to kick the Taliban out of power, and largely they have been successful at doing this. Of course, there's still Taliban present in the region. In all countries, there's people with wild extremist views present in the region. But what we would say is that largely the Taliban have been thrown from power, and we see that now they are working towards building their government. So when we were there to kick out the Taliban, the Afghans were largely, to some extent, happy to have us there because these were a group of people that were oppressing them. But nowadays what we see is that these Western countries that are intervening are actually creating violence, whether it be through bombing or whether it be through different attacks in the country. And we see that this is creating a lot of hostility and violence in the region. What we want to see for Afghanistan is peace, and this can't necessarily be achieved if we are still present. They do not necessarily, I'll keep you in a second, want us there, and we think that this is really something that they need to do on their own in order to create peace in the country. Yeah.
But how can there be peace if there's still fear regarding the remaining Taliban rule?
We would say that, of course, because the Taliban were in power and because they were oppressive, there is going to be some sort of fear amongst the people. But we would say that we have been successful at getting the Taliban out of power, and now, hopefully, the Afghan people are equipped to successfully build their own democracy. We can't stay there until the very last Taliban has died or been killed, because that is not a sustainable option. And we need to ensure that the Afghan people can create their own government for themselves, and that this will reduce the amount of violence that we have in the region, because the West won't necessarily be there fighting and creating more violence. Now, the second thing I'd like to talk to you about today is the fact that the West pulling out of Afghanistan will positively increase Afghan relations with other countries in the Arab region. Now, what we see in order to have a successful nation is that you need to have successful relationships with your neighbors. We think that this has largely been true. If you see the United States and Canada, they both have positive relations with each other, and they're both successful nations. And we see that this idea of having peace with your neighbors is extremely important for a successful, developed nation with good human rights. And we see that because of the fact that the West is intervening in Afghanistan, and because other Arab nations don't necessarily like the Western influence, this is really harming Afghan relations with these other nations. If you look at the different relationships between Arab nations, for example, Lebanon and Jordan have one of the strongest relationships in regards to trade globally. Another example, for example, if you look at Yemen and Saudi Arabia, they're very close and very interconnected. But because the West has intervened in Afghanistan, they don't have that relationship with these other Arab regions. Same thing if you look at another region that's kind of out of the picture in the Middle East or separated. If you look at Israel, because they don't have the same values and they don't get along with their neighbors, this has created a lot of violence in this region. And the same thing for Palestine as well. Because they're under that Israeli influence, they don't have as close of a relationship with other Arab countries because of the fact that there is that intervening there and they aren't independent and on their own and an Arab nation with the same values as the rest. So if we give Afghanistan the chance to build their relationship with other countries in the region, they'll be able to build their own sustainable trading partnerships and sustainable relationships with these other countries, which will really help them to grow and develop and give them the tools, relationships, and connections that are necessary in order to thrive as a nation. Now, what has side proposition really told you today? We have told you that what we're doing right now is not working. We've explained that the Western interference in Afghanistan is not beneficial in any way whatsoever. My partner explained that the fact that we're there helping is not going to create a sustainable future because the Afghan people need to set up their own democracy in order for that to continue to work successfully once the West leaves. And she also talked to you about how a Western style of democratic government does not necessarily work for every nation, and it's not necessarily the best option for Afghanistan. And then I talked to you today about how the Western influence after we've got rid of the Taliban is really creating more violence than necessary in this region. And then I also talked to you about how it's necessary for the West to leave if Afghanistan wants to have positive relationships, particularly in regards to trade with other regions. So for the reasons we presented, we beg